Second hour here on a Wednesday. Chris Brown, Steve Tasker with you, and pleased to welcome in now analyst and lead draft writer for NFL.com. It's Eric Edholm joining us here on the show. And Eric, as you might imagine, the offseason conversation has already started here in Buffalo after their playoff exit a few rounds ago. And with the defense in line for probably its biggest change in a decade, not only in terms of, who, but what they're going to be lining up in, it's sparked a lot of conversation, as we might expect. How much do you kind of tie the outcome of what that looks like come the fall to Buffalo's fortunes, knowing their offense is expected to largely remain the same?
Yeah, there's no doubt that defensive changes are coming, obviously, with new coordinator, totally different system, several free agents, maybe some tough salary cap discussions to be had. I don't know if players are going to be adjusted or cut or what, but changes are coming. And so I think you kind of look to that side of the ball as a natural place to start. And, you can look at Denver's defense, obviously, and kind of see the archetypes, if you will, for each position and try to figure out how does it match with what Buffalo has. And so I'm sure some of that's gone on in fan circles and certainly behind closed doors too. But I'll be fascinated to see, how much change is needed up front. Obviously with several guys that could move on via free agency, but also do they fit the new scheme and where do they play? Those are big questions that you have to raise.
Who's going to drive? Across the league, the trends and the position groups and the number of free agents at key positions, the money spots like pass rusher, wide receiver, corner. What's going to drive free agency, you think, across the NFL?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of the top wide receivers certainly might be franchise tag. Dallas has already kind of said that George Pickens, they don't want to let him get away. Even a player like Alec Pierce in Indianapolis, you look at him and you kind of say, boy, he's really elevated with each season. He's a big, long target with some downfield speed, but can Indy really afford to let him go given what they have? Then kind of the hyper-productive guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, that may be the level, Rashid Shaheed, et cetera, that makes it to free agency. I don't think Mike Evans is going anywhere. We'll see about guys like Keenan Allen, Romeo Doubs, but I think it's going to get down to that second tier at receiver. I think pass rusher, people will look to the draft and say there's a lot of talent there, so we can always fall back on that, but pass rushers get paid one way or another in free agency. So when they're available and they're at the top of their game, they usually cash in.
I want to pose another option for player acquisition to you, Eric, and that's obviously the trade market, which, with this new generation of GMs has certainly been on the rise from what it was 10, 15 years ago. And knowing that 10 different head coaching jobs got filled, and a good portion of those teams are undergoing scheme changes, much like Buffalo. There are players on some of these rosters that are no longer fits there, much like the Bills will probably find some players here that are no longer fits. How much do you think, 10 new coaches, and look, not all the systems are changing, particularly on defense, but how much do you think that could spark the trade market this offseason in comparison to other offseasons?
Hey, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but it makes sense, right? Anytime there's mass change around the NFL and anytime you see kind of defensive and offensive trends sort of take hold in the league, those two things tend to go hand in hand. And so, look at, for instance, Tennessee. Robert Saleh is going to bring a different defense than what the Titans had last year. So maybe that's a place. I don't know if we're talking Jeffrey Simmons, but they haven't given any indication their best players up for trade. But you could absolutely see some players who no longer fit there that end up moving on via trade or, some other means. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Plus, there's been, some teams that are making coaching changes that also have players who have either demanded a trade or reportedly demanded a trade, somebody like Max Crosby in Vegas. So, there's certainly a lot of interesting names out there. We almost had there was talk of a Myles Garrett trade a year ago, which, seems crazy now, defensive player of the year. But yeah, some bigger names are getting thrown out there and we're actually getting some activity. You're right. Back in the day, we almost never saw player for pick trades. They were very unusual, very rare. Once every couple of years, you'd see a bonanza, but now they're more frequent. So I think that's another avenue, especially with some salary cap restraints that you say, maybe that's a way we go after somebody as opposed to signing a big money free agent.
Yeah, because I was thinking like even player for player trades could be
And
an
that-
option here. Like you look at, so Tennessee, just to use your example, going from a 3-4 to a 4-3. Tavondre Sweat at 366 pounds really doesn't fit there. The Bills would love to have a nose tackle like that, I would imagine, to add to their ranks, playing a 3-4. It's like, hey, we got this 4-3 guy that you could use. You want to give us Tavondre Sweat for him and like a late pick? Like these are the things that are kind of rolling around in my head. It doesn't have to be a headliner like Max Crosby. It could be somebody like that who's still on a rookie contract.
And I think, one of the reasons why those kinds of trades are more common, and that makes perfect sense to me, is that you have devoted salary cap people who study the salary cap all year long that know their in-house financials as well as the rest of the league. And so, you're always looking for opportunity purchases, right? Somebody with an expiring contract next year that could turn into a compensatory pick, a player no longer needed in the current system that isn't valued the same way they were a year or two ago, when they signed their extension or when they were drafted. So all those opportunities, I think, and just the expansion of how we look at NFL rosters and how we break it down, that leads to possibilities like your Tavondre Sweat, proposal there.
One of the things about this offseason, there were 10 openings at head coach. And like you just been talking about, huge upheaval. Rosters are going to be churned because of the philosophical changes, different free agent philosophies, different types of player profiles. And for the first time in a long time, you got like 3 perennial playoff teams in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Buffalo who all switched head coaches. Who are you looking of the 10 guy? And I know 10 is a long list. I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you got Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, of course. What other of the other openings? I mean, what do you look for from those clubs? Who's going to turn it around fast? And the Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, turn it around, but just build a little bit, right? But some of the other opportunities, who is going to go from 3-14 to 14-3 this year?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you look at Baltimore, for instance, and it's interesting that they kind of go in an opposite direction, getting a younger coach, and obviously somebody with some Harbaugh ties too, which makes it even more interesting. But then obviously John goes to New York, and it's a Giants team that has a roster that's very interesting, some high-end talent. You look at the top 20% of their roster, I think it stacks up pretty darn well with some other teams around the league that have playoff appearances, 500 records, somewhere closer to the top of the division as opposed to the bottom where the Giants have been recently. So, John Harbaugh's history of success, I think, lends a possibility that if they keep Jackson Dart upright, that could be a situation where he kind of turns things around. And Pittsburgh's really interesting too. What do they do at quarterback? Is Aaron Rodgers in the picture? Obviously, Mike McCarthy knows a little about him and history. And they've been so steady for so long. I mean, the losing seasons did not happen under Mike Tomlin, literally didn't happen. But can they take that next step? That was always the knock against Mike in Dallas and for parts of his Green Bay tenure, was that he always fielded good teams, or routinely did, but couldn't always get to the mountaintop. So a couple of interesting situations among those 10 changes for sure.
Let's, Eric, get to your NFL power rankings post Super Bowl here, and we'll cut right to the chase. You've got the Bills in the 5 hole, and you're acknowledging some of the change that's going to be coming here on the defensive side of the ball in your assessment. What do you think, because we've been talking to our listeners about this today, what do you think is an acceptable floor for this Bills defense in year one under Jim Leonard, knowing the collective expectations for the team are higher?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, it's hard to know, not knowing, just how much change is going to be on that side of the ball. And there were some things the Bills obviously did very well defensively. How does that translate to maybe a blitz heavier scheme, an odd front? Some of these things that Jim Leonard brought from, I guess, you call it the Rex Ryan school, if you will, which is a vast departure from what Sean did. So how much does that translate? How much depth is there? Obviously, we know up front there was an issue, not enough healthy bodies, not being able to stop the run consistently. That's obviously got to get better. And what the linebacker position looks like, that could be wholly different. The pass rush situation, where does Greg Rousseau line up? I have all these questions kind of rolling through my head. Is Maxwell Hairston ready for starting duty? Does Cole Bishop maybe level up a little bit in this kind of aggressive scheme? So there's a lot of things kind of rolling around in your head as you weigh the possibilities. I guess the answer would be at least to the level that they performed last year overall. And I know it could look different, but somewhere on that level or better, I think is if you're going to make a change, especially one as dramatic as a head coach who has significant influence over one side of the ball, you better see some results. I think that's going to be the expectation going into a new year.
So the Bill, we sit here and we talk about the Bills 24/7. That's all we think about. But as you get to this point of the season, you watch the Super Bowl and other teams play in the playoffs along with your own. Everybody has flaws, right? The only one that think they're unflawed or is better is the Seahawks, who win it all, right? Even now, in retrospect and in the echo chamber, the New England Patriots are really flawed.
Yeah.
Give us your assessment. Which of the teams who made a great push this year, like the Seahawks, like all these teams, the Rams, the New England Patriots, all these teams that got into the playoffs, the Broncos, who is so flawed that they may not be able to come back and bounce back and have a good year like they did last year? Who's not going to be a perennial playoff team?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, you kind of look at the teams that have significantly tougher schedules. Maybe they're on the the side that gets the 8 home games instead of 9. I mean, there are a number of factors. Obviously, you can lose a lot in the offseason. So, Minnesota last year was a great example. They go 14-3, lose their first playoff game, change quarterbacks, and the season goes off the rails quickly. So, some kind of big seismic change like that is what you think of there. And we could have a lot of teams switch quarterbacks. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be the ones that were winning 10, 11, 12 games and more, but certainly those teams could go in opposite directions. But as far as the teams that are falling off, look, New England faced, I'm probably playing to the locals here by knocking them down a peg or two, but faced one of the easiest regular season schedules that we've seen in a couple of years. And so that alone, I think helped propel them to 14-3. Now they beat Buffalo once, obviously, and had some big victories along the way, not taking away from anything they did. But you saw offensively how they kind of flatlined or leveled off and then took a big dip in the Super Bowl. So, all of a sudden they have some big questions to answer. And, a tougher schedule next year, more pressure on Drake May, more pressure on Mike Vrabel. Limited resources, maybe not as many as last year to improve both sides of the ball. This still feels like a developing team to me in some respects. So, that's one possible candidate that could see their win total go down, even if I think they're still going to remain competitive.
All right, we have entered mock draft season, and you have followed suit dutifully with your first mock draft 1.0. And you've got the Bills at pick 26, taking the linebacker out of Georgia, C.J. Allen, which makes a lot of sense to me because I'm kind of envisioning Terrell Bernard moving to that quote-unquote weak inside linebacker spot. They're going to need somebody to be the Mike. Sure, you have Shaq Thompson, who you could bring back to the fold after a very good reclamation season after an Achilles injury. You could re-sign him and probably for pretty affordable money. But I think you need a guy that's probably going to have starter potential here, and it's a good linebacker class.
Yeah.
Why did you pull the trigger in round 1?
There are a lot of people in the NFL that like C.J. Allen, and so I kept hearing there's a possibility he could be a first-round pick. So some of it was, it's a January mock. It was in the middle of Senior Bowl week, so there's quite a bit of projection going on here. But some of it was, hey, let's find a place where C.J. Allen would make sense. Denver would have been one of them, certainly, and the Buffalo Bills would be another. There are a few other teams that would certainly like him as well, but he's got some fans in the NFL. Receiver was in play. I would have considered really any defensive position for the right guy at that spot. These aren't indelible ink, right? We're gonna keep this in soft pencil at this time of year, but I think you can connect some dots and make a case for C.J. Allen being a smart first round pick for the Bills. So I think he'll go somewhere in that kind of 20 to 40 range, if I had to guess, depending on how he tests. He's not the most forceful player, but really active and high ceiling, I would say, as a player. This could be the kind of guy who replicates that Matt Milano level of play in a couple years, or Terrell Bernard, et cetera, at his best. So, I think it makes some sense, even if it may not be exactly what everybody wants.
Well, I'll say this, in my experience, which isn't that vast in mock drafts, at this time of year, the guys we think would be a great fit are never on the board when the Bills pick at 26. Those guys always shoot through the roof because they run a 4.4 or something like that,
Right.
and they all of a sudden they become a top 15 pick, and they're hard. And that's what we don't know yet. What do you expect? Or your expectations for any landscape shift once the combine hits? Certainly, there's always guys who jet to the top of the rankings that we didn't hear about, and all of a sudden are different. How do you anticipate that changing? And even if it changes like it does every year, what do you see?
Yeah, I think it's going to help kind of break some tiebreakers at certain positions. Wide receiver, there are a lot of players. I think it's a pretty good class of receivers. The more I've kind of looked at this, I think you're going to see some separation. Players we think might be top 10 or 15 picks now could fall if they don't work out well, if they don't test well medically, if they don't interview well at the combine. That's what makes it such an important week. I think the medical and the the interview process obviously carry a lot of weight, but the workouts matter too. So, defensive end would be another one. And there's all different types this year too. And this obviously applies to the Bills. There's the stand-up 3-4 outside linebacker types. You saw it down in Mobile too, the different body shapes. Then there's the more kind of forceful, rugged inline guys. And so, maybe a little flexibility to move inside. I think you're going to see some exceptional workouts on the defensive line, including the defensive tackles too, which is a pretty good group this year as well, I believe. And you'll see a couple of freaks going at it where you say, hey, they're putting up, defensive tackles are putting up defensive line or defensive end type workouts, and defensive ends are doing linebacker type workouts. That obviously is going to help, kind of push them up a little bit. And likewise, the ones who don't test as well or don't get the opportunity because of an injury may slide a little bit. So some of the deeper positions, tight end could be on that list too. I think it's a really good day 2 and 3 crop at the position. So, offensive line maybe a little less so, but wide receiver, defensive line, both spots, and then also tight end and maybe secondary as well. Though that's really the separator week. And you learn a lot in Indy as far as who people have their eyes on and who kind of the hot names are, so to speak.
Last one for me here, Eric. We always kind of keep our ear to the ground on the division, and looks like while we only had one coaching change down in Miami, the coaching changes in New York were pretty significant in light of the clean house project that Aaron Glenn undertook after just 1 year on the job. But what are your early tea leaf readings of the quarterback situations for both those two teams? Obviously, we know Tua's cap situation is a little cost prohibitive unless they get past June 1st and wait that way to move on from him. And then the Justin Fields thing is a little bit of an enigma. Frank Reich's the new OC there. So maybe just read the tea leaves for us, if you could, at the quarterback position for those two teams in the AFC East.
Yeah, for Miami, it sounds like they've made a decision. They're not revealing it yet, but it sounds like they've had enough internal discussions to feel comfortable with a plan. And if I had to guess, I would say they're going to look to move on from Tua Tagovailoa. It just, obviously there were some high moments, some peaks, but it never really kind of progressed past that level. And with a coaching change, you kind of have the built-in excuse of sort of moving on. Now, obviously there are Sam Darnold-like examples out there, so I think there'll be enough teams that say, hey, I think I can get something out of Tua, or I've seen him at his best in Mike McDaniel's system. Let's see if we can make this work elsewhere. And there are plenty of quarterback-needy teams, including the Jets. I don't think they would trade him within the division, but the Jets have to get somebody, right? And if let's say Miami, with their little Green Bay connection there with Jeff Hafley and John Eric Sullivan, the new GM, let's say they convince Malik Willis to take maybe what Justin Fields got last year and a little bit more. That could be your starter in Miami. What happens in New York, though? That's a player that they would certainly look at, I would imagine, and may have more money to offer. So, you could see some interesting decisions for guys like Willis. So they say, do I take less money, maybe a little better, comfortable situation in Miami, or do I take more money and go to a place like New York that, traded 2 of its best defenders and has a long way to go? They were not competitive in December last year.
Yeah.
It's hard to see what direction they're going to go, and the draft may only offer 1 or 1.5 potential starters this year. So it's an unenviable position for the division rivals.
Yeah, and Miami, is there a map out of the Tua contract? It's a $99 million cap hit. Teams have been willing to do it. I mean, Denver did it 2 years ago, and they were in.
Denver, yeah.
So we've seen other teams bite the bullet, but $99 million is astronomical.
Yeah. That's 1/3 of your cap going to a player who
Yes.
isn't on your roster.
That's
I mean,
right.
tell me that's not going to have an effect.
Is it a better way to maybe trade him for a bag of footballs and just pay some of the money and let the, you know what I mean? Find anybody to take him for something.
I think there's a benefit to trading him post June 1st. So you could end up seeing a deal that we know is coming and will eventually happen. But yeah, obviously, I think you pointed out the Denver situation, rightfully so. Russell Wilson obviously cost them a ton, but they're probably a Bo Nix injury away from being in the Super Bowl this year. In 2 years, they were able to overcome that albatross of a contract, that boat anchor of a salary cap hit. So, that's inspiration to teams. We talked earlier about all the people in the front office who spend time analyzing this. That has to be a point that's brought up, is that we can take this hit, and here's the roadmap to do so. Look how Denver did it.
Yeah. Eric, thanks for the time, as always. I'm sure we'll catch up with you a little bit later on in the offseason, although it's never really an offseason, as you well know. Eric, thanks for the time.
All right, see you guys.